On the fourth Friday of each month, from February to November, the museum puts on a talk, and you can watch the videos. They're published on YouTube. Subscribe, it's free, and click the bell, and you'll be notified when the videos become available. Thank you for watching.
Good morning, and thank you for your attendance today and your continued support of the museum. One of the truly marvellous aspects of our museum, as Phil alluded to, is the dynamic and highly regarded research department. Late last year, Diana Soyle, who had been head of research for a number of years, passed the baton to Rod White, who together with all his able team, still including Diana, continues to build upon the strong foundation she established as research coordinator of the museum. The research department is here for you, the community, to help further explore any questions you may have about your home, your town, historical events within the local area. So please feel free to come forward and request any information that interests you. Rod has learned, lectured and worked in the fields of archaeology, computer science and engineering. His interests include the Bronze Age, Eastern Mediterranean, ancient empires, computer modelling and the history of the Bellarine Peninsula. Today, Rod will present his in-house research, Vice and Virtue, Temperance and the Rise and Fall of the Coffee Palace. The appearance of the Coffee Palace on the hospitality landscape in the late 19th century was far more than a brief entrepreneurial dream ahead of its time. It was a response to powerful economic and social forces that had been gathering momentum since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, alongside the emergence of the Temperance movement, which advocated the reduction and preferably prohibition of alcohol consumption. Temperance societies were first founded during the 1820s in the United States and England, and by the 1830s had emerged in Australia. Coffee palaces sought to compete with hotels by providing many of the same amenities and conveniences without the alcohol. Various temperance groups became active throughout Australia, including Independent Order of Rechabites, the Band of Hope, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. These movements aim to educate the public about the dangers of excessive drinking, while also campaigning for legislative reform, including 6 o'clock closing and the establishment of dry suburbs. Closely associated with the broader social reform, including the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which played an active role in the women's suffrage movement. These were the forces that spanned the English-speaking world, were also felt here in the small colonial town of Queenscliff. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rod White.
Well, I'd like to thank Mary Lou for a marvellous introduction. I didn't even recognise myself. But she's quite right about the research department and it basically being there for you as a facility as well. And the reason why I say that is because today's talk is actually a listener request. Last year, it seems, one of the attendees to one of these talks approached Diana and mentioned that they would be interested in this topic. So being a new member to the museum, Diana thought it was a great opportunity to take advantage of my ignorance and asked me to research this topic and present it today. And as you can gather from Mary Lou's introduction, it is way outside my comfort zone. But I hope that you'll find that the topic is not without interest. So, gin palaces, coffee palaces, temperance movements, all these organisations and buildings, they all appeared at a particular time, at particular places, and quite rapidly disappeared. So the question is, why? And to answer that, you need to step back a bit and look at the broader question of why did alcohol consumption become a social issue? And it can be argued that it arose from a combination of economic factors, social factors that echoed throughout the English-speaking world at a particular time. And as you'll see towards the end, even as far as Queenscliff. So to understand this, we need some context. So I want to take you on a small journey, if I may. So bear with me. Let's go back to late 17th, early 18th century England. 70 to 80% of the population lived in the countryside and engaged predominantly in agriculture, rural crafts, cottage industries. And the pictures that have been handed down to us basically imply this sort of an image: bucolic, rural, beautiful. If the people who actually worked in the countryside are ever shown, they're usually just shown as furniture, basically, for the rest of the city, props in the countryside. But the reality was very different, because this is a time of transformation, dislocation for working people, and even before that, their life was challenging as a euphemism. So in rural England, farm workers and smallholders, they'd been living a subsistence life. They were never far from poverty. They lived on the knife edge. Rural labourers typically relied on a mixed economy, wage labour, and I must stress wages were low, subsistent, often seasonal. They had access to common land where they would graze and glean. You may have heard of gleaning rights, being able to pick up wood that had been fallen off the trees, things like that. Small-scale subsistence cultivation, household production. The system offered a fragile prosperity at best. Wages were low and had to be offset by other means. Then, along came enclosures. From the early 18th century and accelerating after about 1750, parliamentary enclosures reduced access to common land. Parliamentary Enclosure Acts were a series of UK laws from the 17th to the 19th century, and they legally enclosed common land, open fields and wasteland in England and Wales. They replaced communal farming with privately owned, fenced-off land. So you had various privatised millions of acres fundamentally changed the English landscape and the economy. Smallholders and cottage holders lost that supplementary income that they used to have and the food sources that they used to have. And a growing proportion of the population became fully dependent upon wages. Rural productivity rose because actually enclosures were agriculturally efficient, but labour's bargaining power declined. Real wages stagnated, and they fell during the 18th century. So more and more people began to rely on the poverty and the parish poor laws. The poor law increasingly subsidised people who were working on wages. It prevented, but it was cold charity. It prevented outright starvation, but it also entrenched low wages and it stigmatised dependency. By the early 19th century, rural labourers in England were amongst the poorest sections of the English working class, and there was very little opportunity for advancement in that system. And you can see that in the artwork. You've got to remember, people like Gainsborough, they were painting for people with money. They wanted the original painting, the rural ideal. So, even people like Gainsborough started to include a little touch of reality. So, if we have a look here, The woodcutter's return. If we, yeah, there we go. Here's the woodcutter's wife. This young cherub-faced young lady has 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 5 children. I'm not too sure about these two. And a cat.
And a dog.
And a dog. And look how young and cherub-faced she's looks. 5 children in the 18th century. You can see where the imagination was working to sort of in this sort of paintings, but its reality is slowly starting to creep in. Have a look at the woodcutter. That's starting to look a little bit more realistic. More Gainsborough, and here he starts to depict children begging by the side of the road. Later on, the social realists came along and they started depicting a little bit more reality in rural life. So you got people like David Wilson, who started to actually depict what life was really like in rural England at about this time. Many of the displaced rural poor start moving into the cities. This is the time of the Industrial Revolution. So you've got people living in poverty in the countryside. They start moving into the cities, looking for work, looking to improve their position. But, as you probably realise yourself, urban life, so the agricultural changes plus the Industrial Revolution saw significant migration, but pulling people into the growing towns of Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham for factory work and economic benefit. Of course, the catchment of that is death rates in the cities. Death rates in the cities at this time were much higher than in the country. They were what we would call today a demographic sink, as in they're drawing people into the cities because the reproduction rate in the city is not high enough to meet the death rate, is not as high as the death rate. So people have been consistently drawn in, large population densities, inadequate sanitation, the rapid transmission of infectious diseases. You've all seen the films of Industrial Revolution towns. And from the health viewpoint, you've got to remember, of course, that the smallpox vaccine wasn't introduced until 1801. Cholera wasn't actually linked to drinking water until 1854. So people were still sort of wandering around thinking about miasmas and all that sort of thing. And of course, the germ theory wasn't even around until 1862. But to make it better, this is the age of the Enlightenment. We have people like Thomas Malthus, David Ricardo, who are writing the essay on the principles of population or the principles of political economy and taxation. And they're saying things like, population will tend to outstrip the means of subsistence, creating persistent pressure towards poverty for the mass of humanity. He opposed the Poor Laws because he said it would encourage people to breed.
To breed.
David Ricardo's wage theory argued that wages would always gravitate towards a minimum and subsistence level. Therefore, if the labour population increases, the labour supply expands and wages will always fall back. So you wonder why economics got a bad reputation early on in its existence. So that's the background of what was going on at that time. So what happened? There was a catalyst. Beer, gin, foodstuffs, they're all made from grain. England in the early 18th century started to experience a series of excellent harvests. What happens when you have an excellent harvest and an oversupply of grain? The price of grain begins to fall. Therefore, landowners' income is declining. Landowners are represented by members of parliament. Agricultural workers at this time are not represented by members of parliament. So what do we get? We get the grain prices falling, the property classes start, or actually the property classes probably were the members of parliament. So the government's response was finding ways to market and convert the excess grain. And so they thought, spirits. So they introduced an act which specifically permitted anyone to distill spirits for a very, very small licensing fee. So you literally could have people in their front gardens, not front gardens, but their front rooms, turning them into basically gin shops. The reason why that was because, of course, why spirits, why not beer? And the reason behind that was basically that distilling is much easier than brewing. So that still, by the way, is not in my house. I would never be seen with those curtains. So distilling was cheap, easy to do, grain was cheap, and because of grain being cheap, also the price of food has dropped. So people who are poor now have some surplus income, so they're able to spend it on gin. And so what we get is what was known as the gin craze. Very common saying at the time was, drunk for a penny, dead drunk for tuppence. I think the full saying was actually, drunk for a penny, dead drunk for tuppence, clean straw for nothing, which was basically where you collapsed. And even Daniel Defoe at the time was saying that the distillers had found a way to hit the palate of the poor with their new-fashioned compound waters. So this became an issue. Therefore, the government responded and they brought in the Gin Act. There were two. The first one didn't really work because there was rioting in London. They managed to bring in a second one eventually in 1751, and the Act raised duties and restricted sales until finally the crisis began to decline. But spirit drinking remained deeply embedded in the life of working class people rather than beer drinking. There was a quite strong campaign actually to try and get people to go on to beer drinking. As a matter of fact, there's Hogarth has a twin to that, which is Beer Street, Gin Lane and Beer Street, which was a sort of a propaganda to try and get people on gin. So, also in 1757, distillation of grain was actually temporarily halted because they had crop failures. That's the background. But why temperance? Why didn't this just remain an issue for government? Why is it that sobriety and public order became a public social issue and didn't remain an issue for government? The reason why was because apart from the economic dislocations and changes that were going on at the time, naturally, as happens with a lot, quite often with, it's a socio-economic development. So there were social changes that were also happening during this period. And these developments would engage with this whole question about drinking. The first development was the formation of one of the most fearsome tribal groups that have been known to anthropology. The middle class. The second was the appearance of Methodism and the growth of evangelism. When I first saw this painting, I thought, oh, it's rather a mad painting. But then I thought, oh, well, maybe it's not actually. I point out this character here. He looks like he's saying, oh, Wesley, you do go on. So, what was happening? Now, I'm pirouetting here on extremely thin ice, all right? People write books about the formation of the middle class. So I'm skipping and moving on quickly. So the middle class, this is about the time when the middle class appeared in England. And where I say contested is because even those dates, there's even academic debate over which dates, whether it was around at this time, whether it was this period. But essentially what was happening, irrespective of the dates, was industrialisation created new forms of wealth for a new group of people. They weren't the landed gentry. They didn't have land, they didn't have titles, but they were acquiring wealth. And a lot of them were professionals. You see a huge expansion during the Industrial Revolution of the professional class. Lawyers, doctors, engineers. And that group began to search for a cultural identity. Who are we? We're not the aristocracy. We're not the working man poor. Who are we? So they began this search for cultural identity and what you would call a social legibility. So they're in a society which had previously signalled position through land, lineage, rank. Therefore, they needed to establish a currency of their own. And they settled on respectability. It was achievable through conduct and rather than inheritance, and it was sufficiently demanding as to set up a barrier for that you have to get over to actually sort of join this new class of people. So when we say this respectability, what we're talking about is sobriety, thrift, self-discipline, domesticity. So this is where we start to see the establishment for the first time of women as being the matriarchs of the household, that sort of Victorian position, I suppose you'd call it. And this became a way of defining who they were. And it distinguished them from the aristocrats, who were known for their licentiousness to a certain degree, and also from working class disorder and riot. So what you had was a group of people who were constructing basically a framework of evangelical religion, domestic ideology, commercial enterprise, and through Methodism and and evangelism are philanthropic activity. And so this is exactly the time when you start to see the temperance societies forming. Temperance societies began to appear at the same time as the appearance of the middle class. The early anti-spirit societies were in the late 1820s, and they drew directly on the organisational infrastructure and the moral vocabulary of evangelical religion. They were backed to a certain extent by the captains of industry, because of course now that the Industrial Revolution was hit its stride, people are working in factories. Captains of industry didn't want drunks working their mill, their cotton machines and things like that. So these were the social changes that made alcohol a social issue of public concern and public action. So it was actually more of a definer of who you were that was driving a lot of the thinking behind moving towards temperance. Okay, so that's the background in England. So what's happening in Australia? Most important, I don't know how I could have possibly missed it. Most importantly, of course, it's drawing on the evangelical organisations that have been set up by women, as Mary Lou mentioned, the Women's Christian Temperance Movement. Because, of course, the issue of drinking in Victorian England, women are by far on the greatest receiving end of this issue. You know, they have virtually no economic standing whatsoever. And, you know, there's the question of domestic violence and poverty brought on from this sort of situation. So because of their impact on women, the women's Christian temperance movements become quite strong. So in Australia, what's happening here? Well, the first thing that needs to be remembered, of course, is people bring their culture with them. I mean, it might sound sort of obvious, but it's something you need to remember. You know the old saying, oh, they have baggage. Well, we all have baggage, and the people who came to Australia, of course, they brought their culture from England with them. And the early situation was early Australia, from 1788 to 1800, during those years, the arrivals were overwhelmingly convicts, military personnel, and of course, drinking was, I'm sure you all studied this at school, the early issues of drinking in Australia was sort of almost unavoidable to a certain extent. I mean, you've got essentially soldiers and convicts out in the middle of nowhere. Their wages, because of the lack of currency, their wages are partially being paid in rum. And you get the formation of the Rum Corps, who made sure that they got rid of Governor Bligh. And they've got a monopoly on the sale of rum in Australia. And the reason why it's rum is because it's much easier to ship spirits halfway across the world than it is to ship beer. So that's the situation in early Australia. We've got these people starting to appear. Between 1800 and 1830, there was virtually no free immigration. Matter of fact, the colonial administration actively discouraged it. They wanted convicts because they wanted a workforce. Between 1831 and 1850, you started to get assisted immigration, and you got the introduction of systematic colonisation schemes, particularly the establishment of bounties, assisted passage, and this dramatically increased free arrivals. Surprisingly enough, between 1830 and then 1840, we start to get temperance societies forming. These moves were bound up with free settlers moving to Australia who were anxious about their social standing as respectable colonials. They wanted to get rid of the convict stain, the association with the early colonies about disorder, drunkenness and moral laxity. Funnily enough, the paradox is with a lot of these temperance movements, both here and in England, is that quite often when they were forming during periods when alcohol consumption was actually on the decline, which seems to sort of also lend weight to the argument that it was more of a way of the social signalling of who you were. So it functioned less as a response to actual drinking levels than as a vehicle for class formation. And it was also indicative of domestic security and a certain vision of social order. We won't get into this whole question about the middle working class questions about the middle class attempting to socially control the working class and turn them into submissive group, but that's another story that is mentioned and discussed. In 1825, the Licensing Act is brought in. Before that, you either had sly grog shops or little shanties where you could get your rum from. With the Licensing Act, most importantly, for Australia, was all pubs, it was demanded that they provide accommodation. Because, of course, we're a large colonial country, people are travelling, they need places to stay. So the hotel then becomes a more general civic institution. You'll find that it's not just a hospitality business in these early days. You'll find that it provides accommodation, it's sustenance. In some cases, such as this one, it provided the first street lighting, sometimes postal services. In many districts, the pub was the only public facility. So it was a meeting place. Some councils were actually formed in pubs, and much of business was conducted there. They were served as recruiting stations during the war, and during peacetime they were quite often the emergency location for civil emergencies. In 1851 we get the gold rush, and suddenly pubs start to look an awful lot nicer. So the Wellington Victorian gold rush saw an increase in the size and the architectural quality of hotels. So you can imagine that this does not go down well. So we start to see at that time the appearance of coffee palaces. The first Victorian one was in Collingwood. And it was to combat the attractiveness of the new hotels. And so they were created by the temperance movement to compete with the large hotels, and they wanted to replicate all the ordinary advantages of those establishments without the allurements of alcohol or drink, providing grand alcohol-free accommodation. The earliest example was in Collingwood. But as you can see, possibly from this image, they weren't aimed at the working man. They were aimed for the middle classes and the nouveau riche as places to come, to say, to mix, etc. The temperance movement also started to create coffee palaces to feed colonial and international visitors, such as the Federal in Melbourne. So this was a golden age of there were over 50 coffee palaces around Melbourne and the Bay. They were operating in Melbourne by 1888, and as you can see what the furniture was like. The thinking. Alcohol was replaced by tea, coffee, cocoa, and aerated drinks, which I believe mean lemonade and ginger beer. In West Melbourne, there was a coffee palace called the Oriental, which records lunch at $1 and praises the kitchen's fresh vegetables and good bread. These big palaces were architectural showpieces, and they were fitted with conspicuous late Victorian technology. So the Windsor, for a short period of time, was a coffee palace. It started off as the Grand Hotel in 1883. 1886, it was converted to a coffee palace. In 1888, it got extended to the building that you know today. And the coffee palace actually collapsed in 1893 when the economic crash occurred of the 1890s in Victoria. And it was relicensed as a hotel again in 1897. So these show places, the Federal had advertised as having 6 accident-proof lifts. Great. Gas lighting, electric service bells, and an on-site ice-making plant. The Oriental on Victoria Street was much smaller, but it advertised its basement billiard room being lit by 26 gas burners, and its bedrooms were fitted with spring mattresses. The Federal in Melbourne was reported to have around about 400 bedrooms and a main dining hall that seated 350, so these were grand buildings. The Windsor, or the Grand Hotel, was at a similar scale with 400 rooms. Now, these coffee palaces grew like smallpox. They were everywhere, all around Melbourne, down Mentone, Parkdale, and even in Point Lonsdale. As you probably know, Cockings. The railway from Geelong opened in 1879, and a wave of large seaside hotels followed, of course, which you still see today. The coffee palaces opened in Queenscliff, Point Lonsdale, Ocean Grove, and Barwon Heads. The Queenscliff palaces and Point Lonsdale, of course, all were built around a seaside resort holiday market. So it was a different market from what the grand coffee palaces in Melbourne were aiming for. They were aiming for, the interstate traveller, the international traveller, that sort of stuff. This was aimed at the holidaymaker. They were lower margin, but funnily enough, I don't think it was intentional, but because of their market that they aimed at, they were far more resilient. They had a steady clientele of middle-class Victorian families who kept coming for their summer holidays. I saw an advertisement for one where it actually said, husbands, when your 2 weeks annual leave is up, you can leave your wife and children in our coffee house because you know that they're in safe hands. These coastal coffee palaces, they leaned heavily on outdoor leisure. The 1891 Geelong Advertiser description of Ocean Grove specifically advertised a lawn tennis court and a bowling green on the property. And the whole settlement was promoted around the beach, the river mouth and the surf. The Queenscliff cluster did the same, with sea bathing and the railway and pier walks being a point of interest. Now, Coffee Palace, for the local historians of you who are here, was originally set up by Anne Jane and Henry Coffey. He was a timber merchant. Eventually, management was taken over by William Coffey. It was constructed in 1889, 1890, probably over that period, and it ceased operating around about 1919. It was sold to Mary Linehan, who was actually quite a famous World War I army nurse, and for a short period of time she ran it as a convalescent facility for recovering soldiers. And then, of course, they transitioned to a guest house and renamed to the well-known Cora reality. Excuse my pronunciation. In Queenscliff, there was Smith's Federal Coffee Palace, obviously trying to ride off the reputation of the Melbourne Federal Coffee Palace in Essex Street. And been able to find very little information about it, actually. We know it was on the SEC side of the old SEC offices, and that I found an advertisement that said in 1906 it was managed by Mrs. Isles. And demolition is unknown, but from the clothing and from the architecture, I'm sort of putting it at a range of 1918, 1923, question mark. And of course the sea view, which is still here today. Building began in 1875, single story, stucco brick, greengrocer's shop and dwelling. 1888, Elijah Wills, who had created it, began extending the premises westward along Stoke Street. The Queenscliff Sentinel of 1890 announced that Wills intended to build a second story, producing the cast iron balustraded two-level veranda onto Hesse Street. The enlarged residential premises were initially run as a boarding house by Mrs. Tippett, and then it was turned into the CU Coffee Palace. It was later run by Mrs. Jane Stevens for about 20 years. Elijah Wills passed away, and the property trustees put up the entire 24-room estate for public auction in 1925. And that was when it transitioned into the CU guest house. Now, Ocean Road. Now, you may have noticed in this talk, I haven't mentioned America. I haven't mentioned prohibition. Well, there's two reasons for that. The first reason is I'm sure you don't want to sit here for 3 hours. And the second reason is that even the tentacles of Al Capone didn't reach as far as Queenscliff. But there are some interesting American influences. The first one is in the Women Christians Temperance Union for Melbourne. Basically, those unions that were created, particularly in Victoria, were created by American women missionaries who came out from the American Women's Christian Temperance Union. Mary Clement Leavitt visited Australia in 1885, and she inspired the creation of a lot of these unions and the largest branch was in Victoria. Mary Love was elected as president of the Victorian Women Christian Temperance Union in 1887. And Mary Love came from West Virginia and had moved here prior to that. But closer to home, in 1869, American Methodists established a permanent religious camp community on the coast at Ocean Grove, New Jersey. It was so successful that they decided to spread the camps overseas, including to Australia. They joined in a collaboration with Victorian Methodists, and an initial camp was set up near Point Lonsdale, but by 1882 they needed a larger area. So they could establish their Australian Ocean Grove community. So Ocean Grove, the Coffee Palace, and the township were a single integrated settlement project. 2,500 blocks of land were sold under a registered temperance covenant to Charles Henry James and James Grigg. The palace itself, which is on the corner of Terrace and President's Avenue, doubled as the local Methodist church for its first service in January 1888. And that fusion of land development, religious mission and accommodation business was much closer in spirit to the American model that had inspired the name Ocean Grove. There's also a coffee palace in Barwon Hills. And there was a telephone line between the Barwon Hills Coffee Palace and the Ocean Grove Coffee Palace, which you could use and be charged at telegraphic rates. As it's not really an irony because it happens with virtually all of them, but of course the Barwon Heads Coffee Palace is on the site of the current Barwon Heads Hotel. The Melbourne palaces were commercial vehicles wrapped up in temperance ideology. They were promoted by figures like James Munro, a politician, a property speculator and temperance campaigner. And they were capitalised by joint stock companies whose shareholders were involved in building societies and land banks. Their daily clientele was business travellers, country visitors, exhibition tourists and commercial trade. The central Melbourne flagships were built for a constant year-round trade of business travellers, country graziers, parliamentary visitors. That trade collapsed with the financial crash of 1891. And it never quite returned, certainly not to the scale that would require a 400-room hotel. So many of those Melbourne coffee palaces were then forced to become hotels. So they could no longer deny the income stream that they got from being a hotel. But Victorian families kept taking summer holiday through the Depression and through both World Wars, and the Ballerine retained its place in that market right through the 20th century. A 30 to 60 room seaside hotel with a steady seasonal trade was a structurally easier business than the 400 room city flagship. But all things come to an end. 6 o'clock clothing was introduced in Victoria in 1916. You might all remember the 6 o'clock swill. It removed much of the practical edge to the coffee palaces. If you were a respectable family or a commercial traveller, you could now stay at a licensed hotel without being exposed to an evening bar trade. Also, the coffee houses were typically owner-operated businesses. They were founded by first-generation temperance enthusiasts. By the 1910s, the founders were retiring or dying off, and the second generation didn't carry the same temperance commitment to the same degree. Coupled with medicalisation of alcoholism, that were no longer seen as a moral failing, and the discrediting of prohibition, the moral imperative that justified low-margin, dry hospitality premises was eroded. Without ideological commitment, the unattractive economics of running a coffee palace into the early 20th century were hard to defend commercially. And so what began in response to an economic and social disruption 200 years before and half a world away, like the Federal Coffee Palace, slowly faded into history. Thank you.